I don't know if you were here when I said I have a sheaf of articles of Burroughs in Palm Springs. These are items that happened to him. This is Lee Chase. I don't know if you met him. This is David Lustig of the San Fernando Valley Museum. They're going to be a big part of documenting Edgar Rice Burroughs' time in Tarzana, San Fernando Valley Museum. So this is news items from Burroughs in Palm Springs. And most of us are hardcore Burroughs guys. We love to dig into that minutia and find out new things about it. The first, and this was done, some of you may have met Jack Elliott last year from Mississippi. He lived at 11, another one of these Mississippians I never knew about. He lived just a few miles from me. He's a little older than me. He was a state archaeologist in Mississippi and big Burroughs fans, and we connected. And Jack did this. He did a search of Edgar Rice Burroughs in Palm Springs on newspapers.com and came up with all these. Now, the first known record, as you may have known, Burroughs moved here in October of 1935 to Florence, and they were here till about May. They rented a house on Arenas Road, which is one up from Hotel Zoso. And you go about 4 or 5 blocks that way, right? And that's the house. It was called the McManus San Andreas Adobe.
Right.
And the McManus family, there was a pioneer family that moved out here, and they were the first settlers who were not Indians. This is all in your program. I'm just kind of high spot what's in your program. I'm trying to put this in your program. And so their daughter really was the one who developed, she married McManus, and they developed Palm Springs. And Palm Springs was they called it the village. It was sort of a sleepy little town. It started off as a sort of a sanatorium place for people with tuberculosis and lung diseases. They could come dry out in the desert air. And right across the street, you see the fencing around it, the remodeling, and that's the Agua Caliente Indian Casino and Spa. That's where the original hot springs are inside there. So the people were named Agua Caliente, which means hot water in Spanish. So anyway, so the people were coming here for tuberculosis and so forth, and at some point they decided, let's make it a resort in the wintertime, of course. The first time he found was Los Angeles Times, Sunday, March 15th, 1935. So this was before they moved out here. It says, night riding popular at Desert Spa. Titled Britons also join vacationers at resort. And it says, in the moonlight, I'm skipping down between, in the old LA text, they love in the society columns to drop names. And most of these, unless it's a Hollywood celebrity, I have no idea who they are. Maybe a founding father of Los Angeles, like Mulholland or Doheny. Those names you recognize. But it says, a desert inn guests, that was one of the big hotel resorts, enjoyed a moonlight ride and picnic in the party work. And it goes on to list a lot of names. And it says, an old-fashioned hayride, followed by a buffet supper at the barn. This was the riding facility for all the society people. Were given for, and it lists a lot of names, Frank Mandel, Chicagoan, vacationing in Palm Springs. So this was a man from Chicago, Burroughs' hometown. Guests were Mr. and Mrs. Fred Mandel, William Robinson, Charles Butterworth, Edgar Rice Burroughs. So this was, as far as we know, the first time Burroughs made the newspapers in Palm Springs, March. He did a moonlight ride. Well, he must have loved it because he came back a few months later. So that was October. Los Angeles Times, Sunday, October 13th, 1935.
Yeah.
Desert homes will have new winter tenants. Many more desert homes at Palm Springs have been opened. Within the last few days, a society from all over the country is making the popular resort a winter mecca. So Palm Springs was starting to get the reputation of a place for snowbirds. It then lists Mrs. William G. Renwick of Weston, Massachusetts, has taken the McManus Santa Rosa College for the season. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Pershing of Flushing, New York, are living in the McManus San Jacinto house at Palm Springs. Mr. Pershing is nephew of General John J. Pershing, who may visit them this winter. So the McManus family had different cottages they were renting out. We go on down a little ways. Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, that was your mom. And of course, you and Caryl, you didn't make the write-up. But Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Rice Burroughs will live at the McManus San Andreas cottage this winter. So they're in the news. And then we have an interesting item, and again, you don't see this kind of personal business in the papers, but I guess because Burroughs was famous. Creator of Tarzan submits to scalpel. This was this was Los Angeles UP, United Press. Edgar Rice Burroughs, author of the Tarzan stories, is convalescing at the Good Samaritan Hospital from an operation performed several days ago. Friends learned today he will remain at the hospital until next week, when he will return to his winter home in Palm Springs, California. Do you remember Ebby? And you called him Ebby.
Ebby.
Right? Ebby was what you called it. Do you remember Ebby going to Los Angeles for surgery or anything about
Yes,
that?
I remember he was ill. I didn't really know why. If you remember, I was only 5 or 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing that I can even remember my own name by now. But I'm open for any questions that I can possibly answer, true or false.
Well, Henry's going to do the Q&A with you tomorrow. And so Henry will be a little bit more thorough. We're just kind of touching spots in history.
Yes.
So, yeah, but if anyone has a question for Lee or me, certainly feel free. And a lot of this is touched on porches. We still don't know. It was some sort of ladder issue or something, but Burroughs was in and out of the hospital at this time. Third annual fete mapped by members. Palm Springs home scenes of parties during the week. This was Sunday, February 9th, 36. So, Ebby, Florence, and you and your sister, the late Caryl Lee, were still in Palm Springs. Society folks of Palm Springs are engaged with plans for the third annual Desert Circus, scheduled February 20th. Plans were discussed last week at a meeting at the Oasis Hotel. Members of the committee, and it goes on to list long list of people in the committee. Let's see. And then it goes on down to mention Easterners guest, Mr. and Mrs. Austin McManus, and their niece, Miss Marjorie Forline, entertained in their mountainside home with a cocktail party, honoring Mr. and Mrs. William Waters, the son of William Waters Jr. of New York City. And I don't know if you remember this, the McManus family, who were the landlords of Burroughs, they had a pink stucco mansion right up back there in the foothills. And I don't know do you remember that mansion by any chance?
I do remember the family, the McManus family, the name mainly.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember visiting we called it the castle because it was the fanciest thing going at the time.
Yes.
And that's about that.
Yeah, yeah. And unfortunately, that a developer bought it, and the city was rushing to save it because it was apparently quite an opulent home owned by the daughter of the founder of Palm Springs. They could not save it. The guy brought in bulldozers at night, leveled it, and that it became the tennis club condominiums. LA Times, Monday, February, let me see. A lot of this is just Burroughs was at this party or that party. So I'll try to skip some of those because it's more of the same. You know, one thing I find out, and I've been doing, for those of you who are in the Edgar Rice Burroughs Press Association, I've been doing systematic searches of the newspaper archives of Los Angeles. And it gives me an entirely different perspective on Edgar Rice Burroughs because we think of him as a writer. First of all, and this is something I've done a lot more research, David, since we did an Edgar Rice Burroughs exhibit at the museum David's on the board of. Burroughs was a very important man in the San Fernando Valley. If you wanted legitimacy to your group or your organization or your activity, you went to the founder of Tarzana. He was, a San Fernando Valley father, and we don't think of him that way. We think of him as the author and everything. But, as I go through the Valley newspapers from back then, there was a lot of, he was always at social events and any kind of, opening of the new courthouse in Van Nuys. He was one of the primary guests there.
So Tracy, he was into his 50s by then, right?
Yes, he was 59 when he married Florence.
Okay.
She was 30. Florence was his second wife. She had met Lee's dad. Lee is Ashton Deerholt III.
No, I'm the third.
You're the third, yes. His father was Ashton Deerholt, the movie producer.
Yeah.
Ashton Deerholt the second.
He was actually a junior.
Junior, right.
Lee Ashton Deerholt Jr. My grandfather was Lee Ashton Deerholt, number 1.
Right.
And
And the way they met is,
I was number 3.
yes, your dad came to Edgar Rice Burroughs. At some point, again, Burroughs was an important man out on the Tarzana Ranch, and your dad and his wife, Florence, came to Burroughs and wanted to produce a movie. I believe that was around 27. That didn't happen, but they became friends.
Yeah.
And they started socializing. And your dad talked, he was sent down to Guatemala as to help RKO.
You have a question?
Question,
Just
yes.
comment, it was Valentine's Day, 1927 was the recorded first meeting when Ashton came over to meet him at
Yes.
Tarzana, February 14th, 1927.
And you want to tell little people why you know this?
Oh,
Demas is going to speak tomorrow, and he's a font of.
I'm among a lot of experts, but I've been doing a lot of research on Burroughs and his body of work, and I'm always very interested in what he was doing at the time that he wrote a particular novel and so on and so forth. And so I'll be speaking to that with respect to the novel he wrote here, Tarzan the Magnificent, tomorrow.
In other words, real world influences on his work.
Exactly.
And so you're more versed. It's been 11 years since I wrote Centennial Celebration, and
Yes.
so some of these days are getting fuzzy. But Demas is the next generation, so he's gonna be the next guy to expert. Then we come up with an interesting article from Saturday, February 27th, 1937. Accidental death in Pearson case. There was a screenwriter. Let me see. His name was Pearson. He wrote Ruggles of Red Gap.
Oh.
And he and his wife came out here and they rented a house. And he died in that house. And it's that house is right, if you go down here to Arenas Road and you go up the street, it's called Amin Casa. It is now a boutique rental. They have about 6 bungalows. The house where this screenwriter died is up there, and you can rent it, and I think they've divided it up. It's the Gloria Swanson residence. Gloria Swanson owned that particular house, we're told, from 28 to 40. I've done some research. Historical Society does not know about where Burroughs lived, so we kind of ran into a roadblock. We're, the people in this room, Demos included, we're the sort of the cutting edge of what Burroughs did and where he was in Palm Springs. So the Historical Society doesn't have porches and stuff. So Burroughs, there were 2 houses there, and one was torn down. So it's possible that was the house. So this is the mystery: is the Burroughs house torn down, or is it Amin Casa? And we went up there, about a week ago, and we toured it. Met Nelson, 2 gentlemen named Nelson and Ramon. They bought it, they restored it. It's beautiful. If you ever want a boutique rental in Palm Springs, I can't recommend it enough. And he took us on a tour. The main house was under rental, so we couldn't go in there, but we went into what was the garage. And do you remember a garage, a separate garage building when you lived in Palm Springs?
I do remember a separate garage, but I think somebody lived in it.
Okay, it was converted to a house at some point, but like I said, Nelson and Ramon bought the house when it was in ruins some years ago, and they refurbished it, and they're gathering the information. And Jack didn't send me the first page of this article, and I couldn't find it. But it continues. Mr. and Mrs. Pearson were living in this house, and Mr. Pearson goes into the bedroom. This is the story that she tells the police, and a shot rings out. And when the police come, the butler is inconsolable, and Mrs. Pearson's inconsolable, and they can't really get the story out of them that the writer of Ruggles of Red Gap supposedly killed himself. Well, Nelson tells us he shot himself twice. So I don't know if he missed the first time or just grazed himself. So that's the mystery. Was the inconsolable butler a part of it? Was the wife a part of it? They were just like kittens or lovebirds, said the distressed and bewildered butler the morning following the shooting. Mr. Pearson always wanted to get his gun when he'd been drinking, but he never threatened to hurt anyone or kill himself. Mr. Pearson loved his life, I'm sure about that. he would play with the gun, and Mrs. Pearson would take it, and Mr. Pearson would take it back from him and hide it from him. So apparently gunplay was part of his drinking life, or at least this was what was related by the butler. There was never a finer couple, and at no time ever did I hear them say a cross word to each other or unfriendly word. And they wouldn't, if one would eat and felt miserable, the other one wouldn't eat. And it goes on. I'm looking here, trying to skip ahead. Death, which put the last person in the brilliant record, last period in the brilliant. These are a little fuzzy. Death, which put the last period in the brilliant record of the cinema writer whose work netted him huge profits, which he spent lavishly, came to Mr. Pearson at his hacienda on Arenas Road. The house, San Andreas Cottage, was leased last season by author Edgar Rice Burroughs. So, according to this article, Amin Casa, if Nelson's correct, and that's the house where Pearson killed himself, was the Burroughs house. But I think as Demos can tell you, reporters get it wrong. This is one source. So when I was writing my books, I always tried to source at least two sources. So that's the mysteries. Can we find, when this is all done, I'll research Pearson and his death and see if I can find more about the history of that. And I think you heard me mention earlier about the circus. The Palm Springs Circus. Do you remember anything about that?
All I remember was the horses.